here's the first question.
Sure.
And I kind of tried to go in order of how you structured it as well in your talk, in terms of what different pieces you brought up when. So you started with a video from Ottawa, I believe. And so the question I have kind of references back to that. How does looking to the past help us improve the future? So in terms of belonging and becoming. I know it's a large question, but.
Well, you know, I think we can't unlearn or undo the past, but we can learn about the past, and we can understand the situation, personal situation of individuals through individual histories, and we can understand collective histories and collective pain and collective trauma. And the young man standing outside the Parliament in Ottawa was asking a very real question: what does belonging look like?
Mm-hmm.
And he immediately then refers to the past, when nothing of, well, he's actually referring to the present and the past, in that nothing of his culture is represented in the streets, in the sidewalks, in the, you know, in the cities and towns that he goes to. So I think, you know, learning about past histories is absolutely essential. Not that we should become embedded in thinking about the past, but that we should use it as a framework for understanding our options in terms of, you know, what places can become. It's only through, I think, expanding the notion of belonging that we're going to get truly, you know, large-scale buy-in to urban futures, city futures, rural futures. If we don't do that, if we don't have a wider collective set of ideas, then we will just reinvent elite communities. And this is particularly the case in cities, where we've seen that due to gentrification and displacement, lower income people, people of colour, indigenous people are being pushed out. Mm-hmm. And, you know, city dwellers are increasingly white, middle and upper middle class. And I want to, you know, I didn't obviously have time during the presentation, but there's a chapter in one of my books, and it's an edited book, and the author describes her experience talking to an African-American man, an elderly African-American man, who's sitting outside a home in West Oakland. Now, West Oakland was, you know, one of the areas that experienced white flight, but the title of the chapter is "Someday the White Folks Are Going to Want These Homes Again." And
interesting,
eerily haunting concept. Someday
wow.
The white folks are going to want these homes again, and of course that's what's happening in Oakland, in Boston, San Francisco, Brooklyn, all over.
Wow.
So anyway, that's a long-winded way of talking about it. But I think, you know, I was going to say, do we use, you know, history as our anchor? I'm not sure we do, but we certainly learn from history about what, you know, what we need to know going forward, and especially in terms of power, privilege, you know, the domination and subordination of different groups of people.
Yeah, and when you mentioned too that you shouldn't become embedded in it, I think that's really interesting. So there's obviously a way to swing too far to the other side, right? To become too embedded in it so that we can't move forward. I mean, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, but yeah, I really appreciate what you had to say.
Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. I think, you know, the other point I made was that, you know, if I walk around Boston or Cambridge, what do I see of Wampanoag and Massachusetts culture? What do I see? This country of the United States is resplendent with state names, town names that that inform us of a stewardship, a fine stewardship by indigenous peoples of this country, the Native Americans. But yet, what do we see of their culture? You know, places like Canada and Australia and New Zealand do a lot better at making us understand we are in an intercultural society. In the United States, we have, I think, erased, and well, yeah, that's interesting. We have erased, and we are continuously erasing that past, that history. Let's let it flower. And I'm hoping, you know, just to bring this into a topical light, I'm sensing a change in this country. I'm sensing, since the killing of George Floyd, a complete and utter revulsion by a lot of, by black folks, but especially by white folks, who are coming to me now, and you know, people I'm on the boards with, and saying, Julian, I need to learn what's going on. I need to learn about this. I need to read. What can I read? What can I read? And there's a hunger for that. And I think that it's also going to reflect on Native Americans as well, that we have built this nation, used their labor to build this nation, and they have not enjoyed the fruits of their own labor.
Well said. Thank you. All right, so the concept of contact theory throughout our conference kept coming up. And, you know, as a result of you mentioning during your keynote speech, could you define contact theory a little more, maybe, and explain how it plays into just sustainabilities with projects like Cosmopolitan Canopy?
Yeah, you know, contact theory came about, I think it was the late 50s, Allport at Harvard, basically did some research that found that controlling for other variables, contact between people who are different increases the likelihood that they will develop an understanding, empathy. Later work even showed that people might have really positive attitudes. So not just tolerance, but actual acceptance and, in some cases, desire for more integrative policies. There's been some naysayers, but I think, you know, it's one of those kind of, it's not rocket science policies that if you, or theories that, you know, if you get to know somebody across difference, and you see another human being, and you just see a different religion, a different skin color, a different sexuality, they become friends. Contact works. And, you know, there's again, quite a lot of research showing that it works very well, especially outside work situations where there aren't the hierarchical constraints that there often are in work situations. Okay. So, you know, just sustainability is all about improving our quality of life and well-being, doing that in a just and sustainable manner while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. Now, I would argue that our well-being and quality of life is improved by having good relations across difference. I think and there seems to be some evidence from mental health work that you know, if you are, you know, bitterly racist, bitterly homophobic, bitterly xenophobic, that you are going to experience certain, or you might have experienced certain trauma in your life. So contact theory, I think, gives us, and gives me in just sustainability's terms, a set of ideas around engagement and creating spaces of engagement, one of which is the Cosmopolitan Canopy, the place where people, I think as Elijah Anderson, the author of the idea, said, where people treat each other with civility and dignity. And he's very careful to say, you know, Cosmopolitan Canopies are not an answer for racism. You know, we could imagine somebody could go to a Cosmopolitan Canopy, enjoy that time, and then go off and be, you know, a racist somewhere else. I think the point is, cosmopolitan canopies are points of contact. And in a rapidly unraveling America, we need cosmopolitan canopies. We need spaces of engagement where we can engage across difference in ways that are respectful, civil, and empathetic. We need it more than, you know, when I started talking about these things 10, 15, 20 years ago, I mean, you know, the need was great, but every single day I see a greater need for policies that get people talking to each other. One example, I didn't give this because, of course, you know, it's it's difficult to get everything I want to say into 50 minutes. Believe me.
Sure.
You know, it's a synopsis of a lot of my thinking, and I could speak for weeks on end about it. Now, where was I going with that thought?
You were going to bring up another thing you didn't get to mention in this section.
That's right. Yeah. In Copenhagen, and what's really interesting is, I mean, you know, progressive cities like Copenhagen, which are not, you know, just full of tall, blonde Danes, they are, these Scandinavian cities now are becoming very diverse. Well, in Copenhagen, they've been thinking, how can we enhance contact theory? How can we enhance contact? And they've come up with the concept of human libraries. So instead of going to a library to borrow a book, you go there and you meet a person and you have contact with that person, you talk. If you Google human libraries, various universities have used it. What a great idea for universities to use it.
That's cool. Yeah.
And so, you know, again, I think I'd like to see the idea of contact theory used more among the general population. We need, you know, we know the ecological footprint, we know food deserts. What about contact theory?
Yeah.
Well, not a lot of people. It's quite a simple concept, and I think it's intuitive. And, you know, one of the ideas behind the reason why Britain pulled out of the European Union is because of, well, you know, and you know the vote. The vote wasn't really about economics. The vote was about immigrants and xenophobia. Yeah. And there was a pretty good correlation between the big cities that were voting to stay, the diverse big cities in Britain, and the smaller rural places that felt they were being overrun with immigrants.
That's interesting.
You know, so again, we can explain, I think, in part, the Brexit vote well, to show that contact theory does work.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Those people in, you know, London, Manchester, who'd grown up in these diverse cities and who were comfortable with diversity, were less likely to be voting to leave.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. A simplified version of that I used to say all the time was that, you know, prejudice can't survive experience, and it's the same kind of idea, but
no, it's absolutely, it is the same idea. Yeah, prejudice can't survive experience. Yeah, it's but, you know, there's another interesting side to this, though. I remember when I was a kid and I was talking to my brother, you know, we were two mixed race kids in growing up in Yorkshire. We were the only kids of color in our school. I think there was one Pakistani guy and one Chinese guy in a big high school.
Wow.
And I remember one of my friends coming up to me saying, oh, we had a really interesting discussion in our English class. And of course, neither me or my brother was in the class, and they were talking about racism. And a lot of kids betrayed racist tendencies. And then when one kid intervened and said, well, what about Julian and his brother Jonathan? They said, oh, well, they're one of us, you know. So you can see here how, I'm not saying it's the limits of contact theory, but because we had grown up in this place, we perhaps didn't experience as much racism as we should have, because we'd grown up. We hadn't just been, you know,
right, imported or had, yeah, gotcha.
So you know, I think on balance, contact theory is a very useful tool to use. And I think, you know, in terms of urban planning and trying to create spaces of engagement, spaces of contact, whether it's the cosmopolitan canopy, whether it's the the park in Copenhagen, Superkilen Park in Copenhagen, where they designed the park around the artifacts from local cultures represented in this highly immigrant district.
Wow.
So I think many urban planning techniques for integration are based on contact theory, whether they say it or not.
Okay. Okay. Very cool. Well, I'm glad I asked that one because honestly, it did come up several times. So I appreciate all that additional information. One other phrase that you mentioned was human scaled versus humane scaled. And so interested a little bit in expanding on that thought, and then, you know, kind of what are your thoughts regarding how to design culturally inclusive rather than just designing non-culturally exclusive spaces. So those ideas.
Right. Let's think. How to answer this? What was the first?
Yeah, there's kind of two questions embedded there. Sorry. The first one was really, what do you mean by humane scaled versus human scaled?
Sure. You know, and the audience doesn't have the benefit of the slide that I showed, but we are witnessing in our cities some inhumane treatments, which mean that certain people can't belong. Whether it's putting armrests on benches to stop homeless people, whether it's putting bike racks under bridges where homeless people sleep, as they did in Seattle, whether it's architects and urban designers putting knobs or spikes to stop homeless people sleeping in the warm areas of buildings, on the outside, but in the, you know, just slightly away from the street. These are inhumane practices. We at railway stations, you know, we see spikes to stop pigeons gathering. Are we going to do the same to human beings? Mm-hmm. These are inhumane. So I referred to just sustainabilities as humane scaled urban planning, because the very popular term is human scaled. And we need human scale, but I think if we expand human scale to humane scale, we're still talking about the scaling of the city as being around the person and the community. But what we're saying also is we must not treat people in an inhumane manner. It's a denial of belonging. It's an insult to people's dignity, and it's deeply socially unjust and hurtful.
Right, got some good notes going. Sorry, I'm kind of a copious note taker. All right. So that second part about, do you think, I thought it was interesting you mentioned that you'd like to see us get to where we're actually developing culturally inclusive rather than just non-culturally exclusive spaces. If you want to expand on that a bit.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I'm on the fence. You know, I'd like to think, like in Copenhagen, the Superkilen Park, that we could design culturally inclusive spaces, that we could design spaces based on the copious knowledge that we have about how different cultures use public space, that we could design spaces that were inclusive. But I then read some work coming out of Australia from the Sydney metro region, where the authors were saying it might not be possible to design culturally inclusive spaces, but what we should base ensure is that we are not designing culturally exclusive spaces.
Okay.
So, you know, and I go backwards and forwards on this with my students. So I think the way I would leave it with your conference is to say, at a minimum, at a very minimum, we should be designing culturally non-exclusive spaces. We shouldn't be designing spaces which have features or have an aura that is culturally exclusive.
Okay.
We should be aiming for culturally inclusive spaces. What do they look like? This is part of a discussion. And, you know, one thing that I am always absolutely open about is that, you know, I don't have all the answers, but I'm the one who asks the right questions. And we need to ask this question: can we design culturally inclusive spaces? Now, you know, we mentioned the cosmopolitan canopy, and in many ways, the cosmopolitan canopy is a self-organized space. It's a self-designed space. It's a market. It's a place that isn't necessarily designed around cultural inclusivity. It just becomes that way. Can we learn anything from that about how to design culturally inclusive spaces? You'll remember the question I asked in the conference: what is the role of planners and urban designers in creating cosmopolitan canopies? Or is there a cosmopolitan canopy dust that we can just scatter around, you know, to help us develop these spaces called cosmopolitan canopies? So at a minimum, we must not design culturally exclusive spaces, but I want us to see if we can design culturally inclusive spaces.
Okay, thank you. Good challenge. All right, so I thought it was really interesting that you talked about creating spaces of engagement that are simultaneously learning spaces. And that particularly appeals to us as community development educators, because obviously a lot of the work that we do is, you know, educating others to go out and either change their behavior or the conditions of the place that they live, work, and play. So in terms of creating spaces of engagement that simultaneously are learning spaces, can you give a couple examples of some that you would really point to as ones to look at for that idea?
Yeah, I mean, all of the ones that I've talked about. I mean, you know, go to Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia, and sit and be a you know, a folk ethnographer, as Elijah Emerson calls himself. You know, go to Super Keelan Park in Copenhagen and see how people relate to the design of the park, its artifacts, and, you know, and listen to the discussions about that. You know, go to the banks of the Charles River here in Boston, and to Herter Park, Herter Park, where there are masses of willows and where the Guatemalans hang out. So, you know, I think this is all tied up in this notion that I mentioned in the conference about the need for deep ethnography. Deep ethnography, not just about collecting data and co-producing data with different ethnic and cultural and other communities, but deep ethnography as a learning process.
Okay. That's helpful. Okay.
Yeah.
I like that a lot. I think that was another question that came up, was about, you know, deep ethnographies. And so you're saying that is a process of not just producing data about a particular demographic or a community, but it becomes a learning process in and of itself.
In and of itself, yeah. Because I mean, you know, I remember I wasn't talking about urban ethnographies as being an expert-led notion. I see it as part of participatory action research in a sense, that it would be a co-produced urban ethnography by the community under study. They would in part define the research and the data to be collected. It could be students. I mean, some of my students would love, I'm sure, to be involved in this. And it could be city council planners and others. So it's a wonderful learning experience across professions, cultures, ethnicities. That's the sense which it can be a learning process. Yeah.
Right. Awesome. All right. Another of the quotes of yours that became popular during the conference was, "There is no such thing as a local. It's a physical concept. It's not a physical concept. It's a relational, cultural concept." Could you elaborate on that a little bit? That came up a couple different times.
You know, this local thing. So I teach a class, and I'll be teaching it this fall, called Food Justice: Critical Approaches in Policy and Planning. And one of the hardest, you know, concepts for some of my students to get over is this critique of the local, because, you know, they're mainly food activists. They've drank the Kool-Aid that it's all about the local. And it's all about the farmers market. I mean, if you think about the alternative food movement, what are the two big things? Buy fresh, buy local, and, you know, shop at your local farmers market. Well, let me go at this the other way. Farmers markets are there to support farmers, not poor, low-income people. Now, farmers markets, yes, they accept EBT, but, you know, but the framework, the political economy of a farmers market is all about supporting farmers, and there's nothing wrong with that. But let's just be clear about that. As for the local, so several ways to look at this. Look, let's look at it geographically. There is no definition of local from a geographic point of view. It's whatever we can persuade each other, you and I can persuade each other, or I can convince you that it is. You know, the 100-mile diet, local food. What is local food? And the evidence I was giving is that a lot of immigrants see local as a more relational and cultural construct.
Yes.
This idea of translocalism, bringing your local with you, it's what we do. And it's not just, you know, poor brown-skinned immigrants coming to the United States. When you look at the Brits who go and live in southern Spain, just as the people from New England and Canada go and live in Florida, the Brits go to Spain and they take their British pubs with them and the fish and chip shops. Everybody does it. It's a form of security. Now, let me just go a bit further, though. The problem with the local, according to a really well-read and cited article by two geographers at UW in Seattle, is that we're confusing ends with means. That what we should be looking for is a just and sustainable food system, and perhaps the local is the means of getting there. But the way we're framing local and the way the alternative food movement frames local is as an end in itself. We want a local food system. Now, two things come out of this thinking. Number one, there is nothing inherently more socially just about the local. You know, I could take you to farms in Massachusetts where the farm workers are treated really badly. Scale is not necessarily an issue that we can ascribe to greater social justice at the smaller scale.
Interesting.
You know, and the follow-on point from that is that what is more important, really, is looking at the motivations and the agendas of local actors in the food system, rather than just assuming that the local is going to be more sustainable, more socially just, etc. Now, I mean, one thing about the local is it is in many ways more transparent and more. There is the opportunity for greater accountability. Yes, absolutely there is. But this does not mean to say that, you know, local and social justice are one and the same. It's just not the case.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that before.
Read my book, Cultivate Food Justice, or I can send you a whole bunch of papers.
Yeah, okay, awesome. I'm writing that down as well. I actually work in a community that translocalism has happened in spades. So now our little rural community is about 50% Latino, and you know, so it's local has definitely become, I mean, my favorite things in Frankfurt are to go to the tortilleria and have fresh tortillas, and to go and get carnitas and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's very translocal for sure. And so that concept, when you mentioned it, was really, really fascinating.
Well, and you know, it just reminds me, in my last class, my last food justice class last fall, I had a student from Iowa.
Oh yeah.
His family has a big farm, and the farm next door to them was up for sale, and it was bought by a Latinx family.
Mm-hmm.
And and it's interesting because here's contact theory right there in Iowa, and there's a lot of immigrants in Iowa
There
working
are.
in the packing plants and all kinds
Right.
of but what the student was saying was that some of the reactions of people locally were what one might expect from a rural area where people expect to see a certain person and not another person, but that this family's doing really well, their farm's doing well. That's contact theory. That's
Oh yeah.
contact theory.
That's cool. That's cool. So from your perspective, and this may this may get into a little too much, and if it is, I understand, but from your perspective, how possible is it, or what are some techniques for balancing economic drivers with just sustainable development? Because that seems to be through all of this, the intersection, the point where the rubber meets the road, the drivers of economic development and just sustainability. Where can we find some strategies to make those work together?
Well, somebody said, well, in fact, there's a paper that looked at My Just Sustainability's idea and looked at a database of 400 cities around the world that are doing sustainability stuff, and they were trying to find out to what extent are just sustainabilities actually happening now. And actually, I mean, the results were quite pleasing in many ways on all of those four pillars, whether it was quality of life and well-being, intergenerational or intragenerational equity, justice and equity in terms of recognition, etc., or the living within ecosystem limits. All were being done to a certain extent by different people. But one of the keys about just sustainabilities is we need to do all four simultaneously to have that real synergistic effect. And no cities around the world were really doing a coordinated, concerted attempt. So, I don't know how we grade that. One thing that was interesting, Latin American, Caribbean, African countries, cities in those countries were focusing on the justice and equity more than, say, some of the northern countries that were focusing more on ecosystem and quality of life and well-being. But in that article, they finished by saying, just sustainability is a discursive tool. It's a tool for discussion, and it's a tool also that is hopeful and future-looking. At the moment, we have an economy that doesn't work in the interests of the majority of people. But we do have a lot of cooperatives. In Quebec, for instance, there's a huge social and solidarity economy movement. Here in Boston, we have a network of food producing and food processing organizations that are a mix of for-profit and non-profit. We have community land trusts, and all of these are coming together in what a colleague and I, in one of our papers, called the Boston local food economy. And we reckon that anything up to 300 or 400 people are probably employed. Many of them are low income because these enterprises are in low income neighborhoods. Many of them have very strong diversity, equity and inclusion policies. So just sustainability is in many ways not a description of now, it's a call to arms for what we need. And one of the things that I'm really excited about is the links between the Green New Deal and just sustainabilities, and the links between the notion of a just transition. How do we transition in a just and equitable way workers from, fossil fuel industries into new, cleaner industries? How do we do that? How do we retrain them? How do we think about that? So one of the reasons I study cities is that cities are doing much more interesting things than nations on this. Cities are doing some really cool stuff that you know, that is potentially transformative. And then, of course, yes, there are scale issues, but, you know, I mean, when we look at cities for climate protection, cities are doing more globally on climate change than nations. Cities are taking up responsibility, and there's a, you know, there's a whole range of economic and socio-political reasons why cities are, I think, the new sites of sustainability action. Not just sustainability theorizing, but sustainability action. So yes. So I mean, the term "where the rubber meets the road" is quite conventional and entrenched thinking. It's okay. How do we do this right now? But what just sustainability is, it is an intersectional idea, and it requires vision, and it requires coordination. It's not. This is not just sustainability. It couldn't be a feature of the parks department or the planning department. It's got to be an idea, you know. And who can disagree with improving people's quality of life and well-being? Who can disagree with the idea of inter and intragenerational equity? You know, the kind of Native American seven generations thinking. This is not rocket science. Who can disagree with the move towards greater justice and equity? We're seeing the cry for that in the United States. And who can disagree with the idea that we need to live within ecosystem limits? I admit the devil is in the detail, but there are lots of examples of where, you know, cities, and let me give you some examples. A lot of the cities that are doing really creative stuff are in Latin America. I think I mentioned this. You know, you've got the city of Belo Horizonte in Brazil, that is the city that abolished hunger, that fixes the price of certain foodstuffs that private sector retailers have to sell at if they want to also be able to have, you know, to sell to wealthy people, and they can sell to wealthy people at whatever price they want, whatever they can get. You know, the city has prioritized city-owned land for low-income groups to produce food. I was at a conference there in 2012, and an enterprising young woman who'd been homeless with her kids now runs a farm on one of these pieces of land, trains other women, and they sell their produce, to their organic produce, to the local school where her daughters go to school. All of this costs less than 2% of the city's annual budget. We need vision, we need courage, and we need mayors who can do something more than the average US mayor does, which is juggle between unions, concerned citizens, and developers.
And potholes.
And what, sorry, and potholes.
And potholes.
Exactly. That's right. I like that, actually. Yeah, my next paper is going to be The Pothole Man.
Our mayor was always saying that he should be the pothole czar rather than the mayor. So yeah,
yeah.
All right. So you mentioned in your discussion a little bit as well about urban versus rural. And so I wondered, you know, having a little bit of time to reflect on some of the questions that came immediately following your keynote speech. Do you have any specific suggestions for our community development educators who work in rural areas to incorporate just sustainabilities? I mean, I understand that there are concepts that can be generally applied, but any other thoughts on rural, since you've had a little more time to reflect on it? Not a lot, a day and a half.
and you know, there's nothing else occupying my mind, or you know, no student thesis to read, or you know, this country imploding.
Right.
Apart from, so in the time that I have, you know, seriously, I haven't really had that much extra thought on this. But my challenge was genuine. I would love to work with, or just be kept in touch with people who are doing and who want to do things that reflect just sustainabilities in rural areas. You know, again, I think one of the reflections was at the concept of sharing, and the fact that in certain rural areas, gifting is really important. You come back and you find a brace of pheasants on your doorstep, and so you then give some fish, or so gifting, and the idea of the non-monetary economy has been very strong in rural areas and could be built on. The idea of local exchange and trading schemes, these are called lets. I don't know whether you've come across them. So the idea is, look, if in rural areas, people are not short of ideas, but they might be short of money. They're not short of skills, but they might be short of money. So what if you paint someone's house, you then bank the hours at the local bank, the local exchange and trading scheme office, and then you can expect that number of hours work to be done for you. And so these local exchange and trading schemes, they're perfect community development ideas because they work on assets rather than deficits, the deficit being lack of money. And the unit of work, the 1 hour unit of work, doesn't matter whether you're a lawyer or whether you're a painter, it still counts as 1 hour of work. Now, to be honest and to be fair, there have been some issues with people feeling that, well, my hour of lawyering is much more much more useful than Alfonso's hour of painting. That is a sticking point sometimes. So this is sometimes called local exchange and trading schemes, or time banking. And sometimes this is tied in with local currencies like the Ithaca dollar, or the Bristol pound. These ideas that you could earn money by doing labour, and then you can spend that labour in another way in your town. And in the city of Bristol, England, the mayor takes his salary in Bristol pounds. So there's a whole local economy to be discovered in rural areas, I think, and in cities, which I think is very interesting and shows a lot of potential. Is it going to change the world overnight? No, it's not. But you could imagine how engaged people could become, how you could draw in those teenagers who perhaps haven't got a job by doing work that they then get something for. And you and I can tell we love this, but you know who doesn't like this? 3 letters, IRS.
Oh, true enough.
Yeah, they don't like it. They don't like it one little bit. Now, and again, I'm not saying that it will be your whole income, but you could imagine that just picking up a little bit of extra here and there by doing this has a learning curve with it. I think
That's really interesting.
I think it's a wonderful idea. Yeah. So, I mean, do delve into that. These local currencies, local exchange and trading schemes, time banking, cooperatives, these are all the things that what's called the new mutualism is bringing us. These ideas that, especially since COVID, people are now thinking more about, how can I help my community? How can I do things? And that's not necessarily just giving a donation in terms of money. That could be donating.
This is more engagement focused than just...
It's much more engagement focused.
Yeah.
So I would say, yes, social economy, solidarity economy, cooperatives, novel forms of currency, time banking, all of these things are things that I think can work really well in local areas.
Nice. All right. My last question, I promise, is how can we as community development educators be intentional about the concepts that you champion? And what would you like to see us start doing, continue doing, and stop doing?
I used to think I was good at asking difficult questions, but
I'm
guys,
sorry.
I tell you, no, I've got to say, as a group, you're very thorough, and I really appreciate that. So, what can you start doing?
And you wouldn't have to have one for each of those, but if you can think of something you'd like us to either start, continue, or stop doing, we'd be interested in hearing it.
Well, just going back to our point that you and I were just talking about rural areas and the local economy and how we could, tinker around to get people to see themselves as assets through some of these skill-based training schemes. Well, one way that I'm really impressed with, and it's often in larger cities, but is a thing called participatory budgeting. I don't know if you've come across this. Participatory budgeting started, guess where? Porto Alegre in Brazil, South America, where the city decided, hey, we need to engage people more in policy development around the local neighborhoods. So they developed this idea of participatory budgeting, where the city sets aside a portion of the, of its budget for people to come up with novel ideas. We've got it here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. 107,000 people in Cambridge, probably 6 or 7% participate. 6,000-7,000 people. And we've come up with amazing things. So we've now got a public toilet, public lavatory in the in Central Square here, where I live. There are places where women can get sanitary products. This is for homeless people, largely. So the idea of participatory budgeting is to have street level discussions about what is needed. Now, do cities put much into their participatory budget? No, but they're generally increasing every year. And Medellin, Colombia, puts the most in. It puts quite a lot of money into its participatory budget, draws people in, and it really gets people excited, and they feel that they've got some investment. So where I was going with this was, this could happen in rural areas, absolutely could happen in rural areas. Obviously the budgets are smaller, but it could also be something that you community development professionals could promote. It's such a simple concept, and it helps shift us. It shifts the needle from, representative democracy to a much greater participatory democracy. People want to know, did the idea that I voted for, did it get in? And, and you could have focus groups, world cafes, you could have all kinds of means of discussing and finding out what's going on. So
that is right up our alley as community development educators.
So participatory budgeting, yeah, absolutely. And again, with all of these things, I'm more than happy to put you in the direction of resources, and I'm hoping that we can keep in touch, and you can let me know how these things go. Is there anything I want you to stop doing? Well, no. I mean, I don't know enough about your organization itself. I mean, you look to be pretty diverse, because I think the point that I was making about representation is so important, that if your organization doesn't look like the communities it's serving, are you legitimate? Are you trusted? Are you effective? Can you do what your mission statement says? And so, I think one thing that I would say, and again, I don't know what the organization looks like. I don't know what its board looks like or its structure looks like, but going forward, looking like the community of community development people is really, really important. And I'm assuming you have diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, and that you're moving from good intent to measurable outcomes on that. So those are some of the things I think. One thing that participatory budgeting, this could be a community development tool of epic proportions.
Yeah.
And if so one stage is participatory budgeting. The next stage, though, is participatory planning. So yes, we want this youth centre in this small rural town. What about the design of it? So you can go further than just saying we want this and having the community allocate the resources. You could then have a subgroup or whoever's interested in looking at what the design might be for this. So participatory budgeting and participatory planning are kind of brother and sister on this one. And again, I think it's right within the skill set of community development professionals, bringing in urban designers, planners, etc. So
I would definitely say, just from my experience, that we do more with participatory planning and charrettes and that kind of thing than we do with participatory budgeting. And I think a lot of times what happens is we have great ideas in terms of engagement, and then it's difficult for us to, implement those because of the economic impact of what's going on. So that's where that budgeting would be very helpful.
That's where that piece fits right in, I think.
It does.
And it would be interesting for you guys. I mean, many cities across the US have used this, big and small. Do some research, see if community development professionals have been involved. And if not, why not? And, I bet you could get some funding to do a little bit of research. Just, looking at emerging best or good practices. Yeah,
excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for all your time. And the keynote was inspiring to our entire conference to begin all the 3 days of Zooming that we all made it through. But yeah, we really appreciate it. We learned a lot, and thank you for this interview as well.
Right. Well, let's keep in touch on these things. And, I really am interested in the participatory budgeting. I think it's so close to what you do already.
Yeah.
It could be that missing link that you just need to, to go a little bit further.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Take care.
You as well. Stay safe.
It was a pleasure. Okay.
Pleasure.
Bye.